She's a world-renowned expert on the work of the German philosopher G.W.F. Hegel. I'm not going to say all of his name. And
that's all we need to know.
Right. She served between 2014 and 2018 as the president of the Hegel Society of America. And her books include, most recently, Hegel's Anthropology, Life, Psyche, and Second Nature from Northwestern University Press from 2021, and also Subjects in the Ancient and Modern World on Hegel's Theory of Subjectivity from 2005. She is also the co-editor of the Bloomsbury Companion to Hegel with co-editor Jeffrey Edwards, which came out in 2013. She has more than I counted over 30 articles and book chapters on her CV, so she's very accomplished. Please join me in welcoming Allegra.
So, my contribution today is called Matters of Principle, Statehood and International Law. I have a very brief premise before I start with statehood and international law. Let me premise that I'm not interested today in opining whether Israel's activities in Gaza amount to genocide or not. It sure looks like one to me, but whether the massacre of the innocent is genocidal or not is not a matter of opinion. It is a matter of judgment. A very important distinction made even before Plato, in pre-Socratic times. And in particular, it is a matter of juridical judgment. Without the law, we do not know whether we are witnessing a mass murder, a chain of war crimes, a pogrom, or a genocidal retribution, indeed. What the Hutus did to the Tutsis, the Turks to the Armenians, the Khmer Rouge to the Cambodians, or the Nazis to European Jews and socialists and communists is not to be determined by opinion polls or editorial board decisions, but by a criminal tribunal. Because, as philosophy teaches, there aren't just brute facts. There are other types of facts, among which are juridical facts, namely existing bodies of law. Aristotle used to stress that willful ignorance of ethical facts is at least as blameworthy as willful ignorance of brute facts. Hence, it is up to the fact-finding and right-based judgment of representatives of the law. In our case, the ICC, this, that, etc., or the UN rapporteur Francesca Albanese, for example, and others. It's up to them to make this determination. And the law has spoken. So that said, I turn to my main topic. When I was first invited to talk about philosophy in Gaza, thank you very much, I cringed. What could a concept-laden discipline like philosophy have to say about flesh and blood issues like those evoked today by the name of Gaza? What can be said from a philosophical standpoint about the humiliation, starvation, and slaying of human beings in a particular corner of the world? And then I remembered an essay by the greatest hating philosopher that ever lived, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and all my hesitations evaporated. Written in the 1750s, of course, about inner European conditions, it is entitled The State of War. And here is an excerpt. You have it anyway on the handout. Image, mute on, image.
Image mute off.
What? Off.
Image mute off.
Ah, mute off, double negation. It still doesn't come up. Here the experts are now, here, up here, why not there? Confidence monitor. Is that the confidence monitor? That's why I'm bringing always handouts. You have the handout, so I'm going to, you go ahead. I'm going to read out loud what Rousseau has to say in 17, oh, beautiful. In 1750, the highlights are obviously mine. I open the books on right and morals. I listen to the scholars. I admire the peace and justice established by the civil order. Then I close the book, leave the classroom, and look around me. I see people groaning under an iron yoke, a starving crowd whose blood and tears the rich drink in peace, and everywhere the strong armed against the weak with the formidable power of the laws. I see countrysides deserted, towns sacked, the dead piled up in heaps, the dying trampled underfoot by horses. It was horses at the time. This is then the fruit of those peaceful institutions. Compassion and indignation rise up from my heart's depths. But it is no longer permitted to be human and to plead the cause of humanity. Justice and truth must be bent to the interest of the strongest. This is the rule. The populace grant neither pensions, nor jobs, nor university chairs, nor appointments to academies, no presidential appointments. Why protect them? Sounds familiar? To counter all this, Rousseau plans to examine civil institutions, not as they are employed by the powers that be, but in view of their original meaning, and that is, in his words, through their principles, so as to correct the false idea that we are given of them by interested authors, and in order to ensure that injustice and violence do not impudently assume the name of right and equity. Quote end. Let us follow Rousseau's plan by examining two civil institutions, the state and international law, in view of their principles. Like him, I wish to counter the pervasive public attempts at making injustice and violence mean their opposites. So let me start with statehood. Palestinians have been demanding to form a state for over a century, and an overwhelming number of states now recognize this demand. So let us begin with the question: why do Palestinians insist on statehood? Or for that matter, why do Israelis? Or the Finns? Or the Scots? You can fill in whatever is your favorite group of people. Can't a people live happily enough without being full citizens of a sovereign state? Isn't there a silver lining to what Karl Marx called, I quote, the concessioned existence of peoples granted by overlords whose greatness is in inverse proportion to their numbers? Well, Marx being Marx, he does not think there is a silver lining, of course. The end goal of political philosophy, he continues in the same essay, is, I quote, the categorical imperative to overthrow all conditions in which the human being is a humiliated, enslaved, abandoned, despised being, quote end. Now, when it comes to overthrowing those conditions, not just for a social class, which was, of course, Marx's topic, but for an entire people, statehood may prove necessary. And to achieve the overthrowing, Marx's other famous standard might, unfortunately perhaps, apply. Philosophers' weapon of criticism, what we're doing here today, cannot replace the criticism of the weapons. Am I doing something wrong?
No, the laptop is misbehaving.
That's okay, I don't need it right now. Okay. So Marx's appeal to a political categorical imperative will send us back to Kantian philosophy a bit later. For now, let's focus on statehood. First, to be in a state means, generically speaking, to be in some sort of condition, right? So what kind of condition is it that the inhabitants of historic Palestine and the emigres all over the world want to live in? Philosophers of the modern era, by which today I mean simply philosophers of the Enlightenment, early, mid, late, between the 17th and the first half of the 19th century. They argued that life in the state, or civil condition, as it was called, is more favorable to human beings than life in the natural condition. We don't really need this right now. That might be just confusing. Image, mute, on. Perfect. I know how to do it. Yes. So, all right. So what do they want? Okay. So the philosophers of the modern era say, well, for human beings, life in the civil condition is more favorable than life in the natural condition. They took their clues, those moderns, from ancient predecessors. Aristotle had not minced words. Quote, man is a political animal. He who cannot, or has no need to, participate in a polis must be either a beast or a god. But for us humans, the polis is important, essential. This may sound extravagant, but in the course of history, a very good reason has emerged for active membership in a polis. In the civil condition, you live with all other individuals who, in principle, are makers of and subject to the same laws as yourself. In the natural condition, there is only one law, the law of the strongest. Here, might is right, and human beings, in the immortal words of Thomas Hobbes, I'm sure that many of you know them by heart, live in continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Can't put it any better. Modern philosophy, therefore, conceives the state as the best man-made attempt at countering or righting the law of the strongest through the establishment of public laws common to all. Philosophers called it the legitimate state or state of right. This is my translation in English of Estado de Derecho, Estado de Diritto, l'état de droit, as Rousseau called it, or Rechtsstaat for the Germans. Here, mere might is replaced by collectively enforceable right. Note that not just any factually existing modern state qualifies as a state of right. The qualification is reserved for those founded on the principle that all members are co-legislators and therefore free to the maximum extent guaranteed by laws of their own making. If a modern state includes provisions for slavery, for castes, or for second-tier citizenship, like, say, an apartheid state, then it is no state of right. Now, as a historian of philosophy, I cannot pretend that this is general consensus. In the 20th century, as we all know, there have been philosophers for whom might is effectively right. Making superior power define what is right and just among individuals and, more importantly, among states. These are the philosophers of fascism, on whose past and present varieties I cannot speak today, though I have to say that it would be a great event for the Humanities Institute to dedicate an event to that kind of philosophy. Moving on, unpleasant philosophy. I'd rather go back to the philosophers of the Enlightenment who considered it ludicrous because logically self-contradictory and ethically perverted to argue that might establishes right. Their reasons were many. I'm not going to bore you with them. Thankfully, we have have Rousseau again, a master at condensing arguments into illustrations. And here I am paraphrasing one of his examples. If I'm being held at gunpoint by a robber, he says, I will of course have to oblige him. But it would be insane to argue that I have a moral, let alone a legal obligation to obey. My robber's threat of violence does not generate my obligation to obey, only a physical necessity to do so. The robber and I find ourselves in a mini state of nature, you see. Now, unlike this situation, in the civil condition, all members are rule makers. It is therefore their general will, Rousseau says, that everyone abide by the rules. And because these rules are citizens' own laws, by obeying the laws, they actually obey only themselves. This then is the principle of the state of right, self-legislation or autonomy, just the Greek word for the same idea, a kind of freedom only available to human beings in this condition. Of course, I know already you are thinking, really existing modern states of right are so far from this description that why is she talking about? Okay, so they are at best vague approximations and at worst pale phantoms of this principle. And yet notice that we all compare reality with the philosophical principle of self-legislation every time we claim, saying that one state is more democratic than another, an economic order is fairer than others, this society is more just than that one over there, one carceral system more or less suitable to human dignity, or when we deplore that a state is betraying its own original principles. Two further features of modern statehood are directly relevant to our topic, so I'm just very quickly going to say what they are. First, a state is not a castle in the air. It comes with a population, a defined territory, material resources such as water, but nowadays more than that, although that one is essential, okay, and institutions. When all this is present, then it is a sovereign state, as defined in 1648 in the Treaties of Westphalia, aimed at ending the juridical vacuum in which Europeans had slaughtered each other for decades on end. Depending on how you count, it was either the 30 Years' War or the 80 Years' War. Completely, that's what Europe was. Sovereignty means simply that in case of conflict of interests, the state is the ultimate authority over its own citizens and their organizations. It means that the common interest has the last word over factional and individual interests. It also means that no sovereign state may interfere in the internal affairs of another, a criminal infringement of its sovereignty. The other side of the coin of sovereignty is that a state is not sovereign, hence not really a state at all, if it has no control over its territory and resources, and if it neither passes nor enforces its own laws. This is why the UN's recognition of the state of Palestine is still only recognition of a right to statehood, not of a state. Not even the combined wisdom of an assembly of nations can recognize something that does not yet exist. When Macron, Starmer, or Carney belatedly join the rest of the world, welcome gentlemen, in matters of Palestinian statehood, better late than never, they are, to paraphrase Marx, waving the weapon of recognition, which many Palestinians must be thinking may no longer be sufficient to replace the recognition of the weapons. Moving on to another feature of statehood that is very important for our topic, I think. A state is not the same as a people or a nation. We loosely speak, even I do, we loosely speak of state and people or nation as if they were synonyms, but they're not. Peoples or nations, as in the Arab nation, well, it comprises 20-some states, for example, so the Arab nation. The English people, who exactly are we talking about? Native American nations, which are really tribes that belong into a state called the United States of America. When we talk like that, we mean human groups whose bonds have been forged by history and geography. Their members may share a language or two or more, lots of dialects, customs, mythologies galore, bits of DNA, musical traditions, whatever. But the state of right does not coincide with any of these, not even with all of them together. It does not coincide with a specific people. It encompasses all sorts. This seems trivial, but although each state is one juridical individual, indeed it has a name, a place, etc., it is never one human individual with ethnic ancestors, religious delusions galore, brown hair, blonde hair, or gastronomical preferences. A state of right is neither Jewish, nor Spanish, nor Arab, nor whatever, nor English, okay? It is no ethno-state. It is, to repeat myself, the political framework in which Jews, Spaniards, Arabs, or Englishmen, or Bangladeshis, etc., abide by laws of their own making. Attributing human qualities to the state and conflating statehood with a specific people is, of course, the hallmark of nationalism. We all know the results of the identification of Staat and Volk in 20th century Germany. No need to go there. A less bloody, but still vicious consequence of the conflation is what we face in academia and on the streets today. Criticism of a state is lumped together with criticism of an ethnicity. I'm gonna skip a few things. And by the way, if I may, if one follows the logic that connects the state to the ethno-state and the ethno-state to territorial rights dating back to millennia, then most currently existing states would have rights to territories well beyond their borders. And by the way, they would lose rights to territories inside their borders. But that's a detail that nobody thinks about. Think for a moment of the Italians, if I may. Claiming the Romans as part of their ancestry, people can say what they want about these things. Nobody knows exactly, but let's say it's true, okay? The Romans is part of their ancestry. Italians would have the right to evict most Britons from Bath to Hadrian's Wall. And we all laugh when we say these things. That's a joke. Well, it is a joke for all the rest. Only not, for example, Netanyahu has repeated that yesterday, I think. I can't keep up with this, okay? But it's just extraordinary, okay? So maybe we should just say, go to Bath and evict the Britons. To sum up, the state has no human qualities. To claim otherwise is a logical fallacy of gargantuan proportions and eventually deadly consequences. The ethno-state is the denial of the state of right. It is a measure of our time's regressive thinking and politics, I think, that in the 19th century, first half of it, even a conservative like the German philosopher Hegel wrote a scathing rebuke of critics of all people, the King of Prussia, because of the king's decision to make Jews full citizens of the state of Prussia. Projector mute on. No, what? Off.
Yeah.
Is it there? I always need the technicians. why do I have to go back in? This is an important quote. This is what he says. Perfect. Thank you very much. 1820. So, look. The outcry, says Hegel, the outcry against giving Jews full rights ignored that they are first and foremost human beings. Mention, which is not a superficial abstract quality. He then continues, I have dots there, saying it is the basis for being a full person with right. You have to be human. A dog will not do. That's what he means, okay? So, it's not a superficial abstract quality. To refuse civil rights to Jews would rather have preserved the segregation with which they were being reproached. They want to keep for themselves, people say. Something for which the state would have to be blamed, and rightly so, because it would have misunderstood its own principle. Okay, I move on to the other principle, namely international law. I mentioned that sovereign states may be viewed as autonomous entities. That we don't need anymore. Perfect. I mentioned that sovereign states may be viewed as autonomous entities on the world stage. Just like individual citizens are to be equal before domestic laws, the argument goes, so individual states are to be equal before worldwide laws. This has two consequences directly relevant to our topic. First, juridical entities, like persons or states, do not admit of degrees, just as it is and was mere fiction to count a human individual as 3/5 of a person, so a sovereign state cannot be a fraction of one. I note that the current PM of Israel twice mused in public that Palestinians could be, and I quote him, I have the place in the footnote if you don't believe it, the Palestinians could be offered not exactly a state with full authority, rather a state minus, quote end. I assume that the Trumpian-style truncated sentence was meant to end with the word sovereignty. It was, of course, an offer that was not one. Second consequence from that scenario, it follows from universal state sovereignty that each and every state, just like every person, has an absolute right to self-defense against external attacks. That makes sense. But another consequence is being falsely drawn, namely that non-state entities do not enjoy the same right. Ergo, when the leaders of a non-state retaliate through murder and maiming, it is called terrorism. But when the leaders of a sovereign state retaliate through murder and maiming, it is called legitimate self-defense. Anyone can see, I think, why in the contemporary world, statehood is imperative for peoples to survive. Let me now very loosely sketch Kant's argument that a higher-ranking international authority is not optional, but required for state-organized humanity to continue to exist in the short or long term. Like individuals in the state of nature, sovereign states, says Kant, left to their own devices, tend to follow the law of the strongest. That's just a general tendency. May I add something that Kant had no idea of, that Secretary of State Peter Hegseth put it in the following words on occasion of the title change of his department. He says the aim is to deploy maximum lethality, not tepid legality. Well, Kant says this is exactly what they think, if left to their own devices. To enable states' peaceful coexistence, Kant maintains instead, there must be a, quote, federation of free states, adopting a common law that prevents war and curbs the tendency to defy the law. The current, this is 1795. The current incarnations of this federation, let's say the UN, the Security Council, you name it, the ICC, etc., weak as they are still the best thing humanity has available to counter and punish adherents and sponsors of the might makes right doctrine on the global stage. And here's an analogy, allow me this one, not by Kant again, by me. Picture a serial killer found guilty beyond reasonable doubt. Imagine also that he has such an awful personality that even his family wants him gone. Yeah, there are people like that. Okay. So, why don't judge and jury just hang him on the spot and make everyone happy? The reason why not, as a comedian put it of late, referring to the IDF's actions in Gaza, is that, I quote the comedian, there are rules to this shit. Quote them. For a state going to war, the laws of war of the Geneva Conventions are the rules to this shit. The fact that a war becomes a criminal enterprise if it violates existing laws of war is based on Kantian arguments, which I will spare you, but they result in two claims. First, that genuine political action and legislation and ethical goals are inseparable, and that therefore, number two, genuine politics and legislation aim at securing the right of humanity, as he called it, above all other goals. Let me explain. Segregation politics and laws in the Alabama of the 60s are trivially enough legal. They are on the books. They have been written down under democratic decision-making, blah, blah, I don't know. Anyway, there was no dictatorship in Alabama. They have decided to do it, and apparently that was very democratic. So they are trivially enough legal, yet arguably they are juridical wrongs, not to mention ethical wrongs. But why? See, the philosophers always ask why. We don't want to take anything for granted. Look, Martin Luther King answers that a human law is rightful only if compatible with a higher ranking, i.e. principle, divine or natural law, he called it because he was a Thomist, whose aim is human flourishing. But segregation is incompatible with human flourishing. I'm skipping the proof of that. Therefore, laws and politics aimed at segregation are demonstrably wrongful. Just like for MLK, for Kant, right and wrong laws and politics differ based on their end goals. That's how you can tell. Instead of human flourishing, which Kant, being a German philosopher, found a bit vague, he argues that rightful laws and politics are only those promoting human rights. Conversely, any law and politic that requires sacrificing human rights to obtain extraneous goals, wealth, power, the Gaza Riviera, somebody else's happiness, whatever. All those are demonstrably wrongful because the goal is not human right. But why? Long story short, and I'm almost done, human beings, says Kant, are able to establish their goals not only by instinct, but also through reason. Therefore, humans are not just living creatures able to devising clever means for arbitrary ends. They are themselves living ends, or in Kant's terminology, ends in themselves. That is why, as in the categorical imperative evoked by Marx and by me at the beginning, politicians, military leaders, or militias using children and other civilians merely as instruments for ends extraneous to their inherent rights are definitely and demonstrably criminal agents. Yeah, that is part and parcel of the ICC decision to denounce both Israeli authorities and Hamas leaders as criminals. itself is what the right of humanity is all about. Another word for it is human dignity. The opposite of respect for dignity, as you know, is humiliation. No surprise then that leaders waging criminal wars like to humiliate their enemies by calling them animals, as happened again recently. They're not just adding insult to injury, nor do they actually believe their victims to be subhumans. I don't think, at least I don't believe propaganda so literally. It's that by publicly removing humanity from their victims, they hope to remove criminality from their own actions. So, I wish I had an upbeat message to conclude, but I don't. Except to say that history will not end anytime soon, and some enlightenment always returns after darkness. Today, I hope at least to have shed a bit of light on why, from a philosophical perspective, the founding of a Palestinian state of right is a historical and ethical necessity. To get there, a first step is to become clear about the naked reality of this conflict and name it as what it is. Neither a war between states, because there is only one state at issue. That's not probably a war. Nor is it the medieval siege of a fortified citadel, but a savage case of archaic, biblical, Homeric conflict waging. It is the raising of Troy. Thank you. Sorry for being So I did the ideal part. He's going to do the real part. That's gonna be something.
Oh dear.
Oh dear. Let me just read from one of his many books, his biography. John Davenport teaches political and moral philosophy at Fordham University. He is the author of A League of Democracies, which was here a moment ago. Oh, here, yes. Which develops themes in cosmopolitan thought and interprets the Federalist Papers as a basis for conceiving a global democratic alliance. He's, of course, also the author of more books. You can just check them out here today, right?
Sure. Yes.
That's why we have them. So please, John, go ahead.
Well, thanks for having me. Hope my voice holds out here. I do have something to put on the screen, but it's just what you have in the handout for the most part. So, yeah, I guess we can turn that on. And just want to say thanks to Allegra and thanks to the Institute for inviting me. Can you hear me in the back? I'll try to be loud. I am conscious, maybe I should say right at the outset, I don't really consider myself to be a true expert on this topic. Neither am I Palestinian or Jewish. I don't have family in Israel or anywhere in the Middle East. So why am I talking on this topic? I teach human rights issues, global justice issues, and feel some obligation, therefore, to speak about such a momentous set of events and ongoing set of problems in our time. So that's the reason, straightforwardly. The talk is divided into sort of three portions. The first of which, this here, is, I would say, facts. And here you'll see some of the comparisons. Sorry for there being so many photos. We can take a look at them if we need to in the discussion time. But on the handout, and hopefully you all have, you'll see a number of historical comparisons that I started, well, I became obsessed with actually in thinking about the situation in Gaza. The second part of this is about motives, and the third is about solutions. And I'm going to try to go pretty quickly through the first two parts so that we can get to probably what many of you would like to discuss and think through the question of solutions, and I don't know that I've really got a final definitive answer, unfortunately. So with regard to facts, I have a lot of verbiage here about what's occurred, if any of it is actually in serious dispute. I could read some of this. But let me start with this historical tidbit. Over 32 years ago, on September 13, 1993, Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin addressed a press conference at the signing of the first Oslo Accords. Some of you are old like me will remember this. Enough with blood and tears, enough. The time for peace has come. Today we seem a very long way from the hopes expressed on that bright morning. And we could debate about whether the Oslo Accords were the right direction to take, or whether they, were ultimately, based in kind of disingenuous policy in some way. There are lots of opinions about that, but nevertheless, the kind of stark contrast between that moment and today, so much later, is surely apparent to everyone. The horrors that have unfolded in Israel and the Gaza Strip during the last 2 years include massacres, including that on October 7, sieges, although not a medieval siege, I think Allegra's right to point out the difference, ruined cityscapes reminiscent of World War II and the Syrian civil war. And we all know how painful it's become to face these issues and to discuss them with friends, relatives, in my case, students. The issue is so difficult that I offer my students to talk about this in a separate session outside of regular class, because, we value both our Jewish and Islamic students very, very much, and don't want them to feel uncomfortable. So I'm sorry if you are personally feeling this in your own families. Many of you very well might be. The situation is just that bad that it's produced this kind of result. And I think the tensions, are for good reasons. After the murders perpetrated on October 7 and Israel's fairly immediate response in the next few weeks, the IDF's tactics, that is the Israeli Defense Forces, in my view, turned to something like a scorched earth playbook. But it's used before in parts of the West Bank, Lebanon, and Gaza, namely leveling whole neighborhoods from which Palestinian attacks on Jewish civilians had come. First with missiles, bombs from the air, and then with tanks and other artillery. It is, I believe, a policy of collective punishment that has been used throughout this war on Palestinian towns in the West Bank as well, though with little American media attention there. All of it's been focused on Gaza. In this respect, the war led by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his war cabinet resembles, to some extent, U.S. General Sherman's burning of Atlanta and other southern cities late in our Civil War, with the difference that Sherman usually at least tried or made a half-hearted attempt to warn civilians to get out, and so they could flee in time before the cities were burned to the ground. Now, some of you may disagree with some of these comparisons. Maybe I'll skip here a bit in the interest of time. If you do, I'm happy to come back to these. I just would beg anyone who is skeptical, say, about the death toll, the number of people who are civilians killed instead of Hamas, how many photos might have been faked. We hear these sorts of arguments all the time now, right? And it's part of what has complicated the issue in American discourse. Questions about how many hospitals or medical facilities have been attacked. I've read a figure of 650 recently. Suppose that you're very skeptical about all of that. That's fine with me. I mean, at least we could set it aside and discuss it if you want. It's a problem that in this kind of setting, as in a college class, we couldn't settle these detailed questions without going into a lot of empirical research. And so philosophers are especially stuck having to just kind of posit or assume certain facts for the sake of argument, as is the case here. I would just ask anyone, and if you're in discussion with skeptics who could be very good friends, I am in this situation, right? I would ask them just one thing: believe the aerial footage, believe the photography, right? Could there be some faked images? Have there been? Yes, absolutely. And this problem is going to increase in the age of AI. But there's the chance that hundreds of thousands of photos are fake is literally zero. It's less than the chance that Americans never landed on the moon. That conspiracy is far more likely to be true than that every, it is, if you just did the statistics, like about 6,000 people would have to be in on that one, right, for it to be fake. But the images coming out of Gaza are far larger. I think, you know, the desperation to maybe cling to that kind of explanation in some quarters of American politics just speaks to how difficult emotionally the issue is to face. And I mean, you know, assertions that there's a lot of stage managed, you know, theater blood being used with fake parents who appear aggrieved and so on. I mean, it would be more than a miracle to, you know, to produce half of that level of footage, right, in a war zone like this. So those are the facts that I'm going to stipulate as to what's happened in Gaza. As for the comparisons, maybe we won't run through all of them, but consider this one. The atomic bombing of Hiroshima included some 63,000 buildings. This is far less than the number obliterated in Gaza. Now, the death toll was higher in Hiroshima, 140,000 roughly, but that's because of the radiation. Give the war in Gaza and famine another year, and we could maybe be reaching that level of death toll, God forbid. I hope it doesn't last that long. But it's not inconceivable. There's this comparison as well, right? While many Hiroshimans lingered for days or weeks before dying from the radiation, many thousands of Gazans, presumably many children, and this never seems to come up in the media coverage for some reason, but sticks in my mind. They have died slowly, underneath rubble. Lack of water, lack of food, maybe not even a human voice within their reach. The same in Syria, I would say, right? So we have to take into account this pattern in a lot of recent wars. It's not just Gaza. And that surely is torture, if anything is. So I want to, with these comparisons, draw attention to something I think that's very important about recent wars, and this goes to one of the questions of motive. Why so much bombing, right? Why so much leveling of cityscapes? I mean, this happened in Mosul when the Allied, you know, the American-led Allied forces with Iraqi forces liberated Mosul from ISIS. That happened in Raqqa, similar, you know, situation with ISIS there. It certainly happened in Syria. I mean, we see it again in Ukraine. That's a bit different. Why so much bombing? I think the answer is very clear. It comes from, it's a matter of military strategy, because the leaders of our armed forces in developed Western-style democracies, if we could consider Israel that to be one of those, they don't like to see a body count among their own soldiers for understandable reasons. They're answerable, elected leaders, and so it's likely to save. How many lives has Israel saved of its IDF soldiers, let's say? Suppose they've done almost no bombing, but just gone in on the ground, right? Building to building to building. The Americans tried to do this in Fallujah, at least in the first instance, and were driven back and didn't succeed. Then they leveled more of Fallujah the second time they went in. Most of the civilians had left, so the death toll was in a few thousand range, of the total, maybe 3,000 over the both interventions in Fallujah. The reason that our armed forces are doing this is because it saves a few thousand of our soldiers. So I'm going to guess, I mean, of course, it's very hard to know, but the IDF might have lost, what, 5, 7, 10,000 Israeli soldiers? I mean, that obviously would have been devastating and catastrophic to their families in Israel and in the United States. But I do think we have to understand that this is what's happening in recent wars. The armed forces are more determined to reduce their own death toll than to uphold the Geneva Conventions. And in particular, that aspect of all of the laws of war that says armed forces are supposed to take the hit and put the risk on themselves in order to minimize civilian casualties. So that's not been happening. And the reason for that, it's what economists call a principal agent problem, if you want to give it a label. That means the tail is wagging the dog. Like if you're an accountant, we're investing in things that make money for them and not for you. anytime that an agent that works for you is putting their interests first. Now, it's a very hard thing to say, but I'm going to say it right here now as an American citizen. I believe, and I have a niece in the Air Force Academy, that our officers and soldiers need to put themselves at greater risk in order to reduce civilian casualties in any war in which we're engaged. And that is precisely what has not been happening in Gaza. So that, I think, more attention is needed to this aspect of the conflict. Hopefully it's helpful to think about the historical comparisons in that light. Now, to go back to Hiroshima, why was it done in that case? Well, because the predictions, the analysis from the Defense Department, or was it the Department of War then? I can't remember. Can the president unilaterally change the name? The predictions were something like 100,000 American servicemen could have been lost. So I can see that Truman, if in fact he really made the decision, there's some debate about that. I could see that's a big dilemma. But 100,000 is not 5 or 7,000, right? I mean, that's a big difference. In large number terms, that's a relatively small loss, you know, in comparison to casualties in World War II, or let alone World War I. But for contemporary militaries in developed democracies, it looks like a very high body count. So I think we need to keep that in mind. And the other goal, and I'm very sorry to say, in the campaign in Gaza, at least the way that it's unfolded, and the particular tactical decisions, as well as the large-scale strategy that we see unfolding, very clearly seems to me to be partly a matter of venting built-up rage. Rage that maybe we can understand in the sense that, you know, Israelis have been attacked numerous times by, you know, missiles, artillery, and more recently, ground forces coming out of Gaza. The repetition of such things does build up hatred and rage. But it looks to me like what's happened in Gaza is, in part at least, bloodlust. A revenge-motivated reduction of the cities in Gaza to ashes and dust and rubble. And in this respect, the best comparison would be the leveling of Dresden. There were some military targets in Dresden in World War II. Or if you prefer, the leveling of Tokyo, the firebombing of Tokyo, which actually just destroyed more buildings than in Hiroshima. That arguably you could have said there was some military necessity, but Dresden, probably not, right? I mean, the vent-up rage, especially among British people, you know, having endured the Blitz, everything they went through in the early years of World War II, I think came out at that point, and you could see the results. So this is human nature, but it's an awful fact about war that this can happen. And in a way, it's like the My Lai massacre in the Vietnam War. It's something that contemporary militaries and our civilian command of them need to grapple with. So how can we come to terms with that with Gaza? Maybe there will be war crimes tribunals and prosecutions. Those, in any case, are the comparisons, and I could say more about them if you're interested. It's complicated in cases like Kobani, Mosul. It's difficult when you have a militia that's entrenched, you know, in an urban area. Could there be some truth to allegations that Hamas operates in tunnels under hospitals? Maybe. I'm not qualified to dispute, to decide that question. You know, could there be truth that there's missiles placed on top of buildings? Sure, it's possible, I think. But I want to say, as a principle of military ethics, it's not acceptable, and it constitutes a violation of the principle of discrimination, is what it's called, the sparing of civilians. It's not acceptable to say there's a 10% chance that there's one Hamas fighter or two in a 20-story building, and therefore we're going to destroy it with all the people inside it. That goes way beyond the level of collateral damage that's acceptable for that little amount of risk reduction, right? Just imagine that there were a murderer here in, I don't know, some American city. Something like this happened in Philadelphia many decades ago. And the murderers holed up in, you know, a house or something with a bunch of people. And the decision to get them, it's like, well, we've got to get this murderer. They're a huge danger, and maybe they're going to escape at night or, and kill more people. Maybe that's true. But imagine that the police just dropped a bomb and killed like 80 people in the house along with the murderer. I mean, they'd be in court for murder, being tried for murder the next day, right? So that's a domestic analogy with the law of war, which doesn't always work, but it's these kinds of analogies are useful for thinking about how to understand the laws of war and their application to these very difficult situations. I guess I'm supposed to scroll down here, I'm sorry. All these figures. Stalingrad, we read, is the most lethal of all human battles in human history. 3 million dead. In this case, it's because land armies are operating against one another within the city, though. I knew an old woman who was Jewish, Rebecca Shapiro, who came from Stalingrad and lived through that. It was too horrible a story for her to tell, what she endured and saw there. So that's on the list because of its historical significance. Shall we move on to the, oh no, maybe I only have the first scenario here. I'm not sure it's going to go down further. Should we move on to possible solutions?
We all have the handout, right? Everybody has
Yeah.
Yeah, so you can just all look. Obviously, there's not time to read through all of these. And of course, we want your questions and discussion here. I hope that I'm conveying my sense of concern for both, Israelis and Palestinians. I really think that I am in the situation of many Americans in feeling that, right? And I honestly worry, of course, for the future of Palestinian people in Gaza and the West Bank, but I also worry for the future of Israelis. I'm not sure what the long-term consequences of this are going to be, and whether actually in the long run, many people currently living in Israel or say in the US may be less safe. So let's look through these quickly. And this was not easy to write and think through, I can tell you. So for so many years, like Allegra, my assumption has been that, a two-state solution negotiated with land swaps is the way to go. I watched very carefully when Bill Clinton was having those meetings at Camp David. It looked like something was going to be resolved. Also a heavy topic of debate, exactly what happened there. But I must say that after the events of the last 2 years, it's unclear to me whether a two-state solution is as viable as it was once assumed to be. But maybe we do need, for the reasons that Allegra laid out, maybe we do need to maintain it nevertheless, however difficult it may now be to foresee how to bring this about. Because while not every ethnic or ethno-religious group needs a state, as you pointed out very correctly, we have 1,000 or more countries on Earth, or we have to redraw all these borders. In some cases where there's such a difficult history, it could be for remedial purposes that a Palestinian state is needed, at least as a temporary measure for some number of years, right, in order for self-determination to become possible. So I'm wanting to say here that I'm still very much open to that possibility. So anything is better than the continuation of the status quo. And that I won't read all of this, but I'm afraid this is the track we're on. That's scenario A that you see a little bit of in the handout here. This could happen, right? That we just have Palestinians in Gaza concentrated into a few areas of Gaza, by the hundreds of thousands packed into small areas that mostly living in tents around rubble, on aid. God, this could go on for years, right? That's, I think, the worst case scenario, other than, well, the complete annihilation of everyone would be worse, obviously. But I do think that along that path, there are many, many negatives that would come. Israel would be sure, I think, to become a pariah state to most of Europe. It's likely that in that kind of case, it would join sort of the crony capitalist regimes that have implemented far-right playbooks around the world. It would have to, stand up a huge propaganda machine to justify the continuation of that kind of scenario in Gaza. I don't think any of us would want that for any nation with whom we have still friendly relations. and along that, yeah, the Riviera and so on, right, would be all part of that scenario. So what about the two-state solution? And I did publish an op-ed on this in Newsweek early in the war, so I was on record in supporting a two-state solution then. I think the most important thing to stress about this, and it pertains to some of the other scenarios as well, is that we're going to need a coalition of nations, hopefully including several from the Middle East, maybe some other Muslim majority nations. This would be great if we could get forces, say, whether it's under NATO or UN flag, whatever it is, we need a coalition that stands up a large ground force, right? Maybe we could get some forces from Malaysia or Indonesia or even Pakistan. Those might be a little more suspect to some, maybe to some of the powers in Jerusalem. But we'll need European forces. I'm not sure whether American forces would be very helpful in this case, maybe a small contingent, some officers. I say this because it's very clear that Israeli authorities, even if Netanyahu were to leave power and you had a new prime minister, are not going to accept Hamas or any successor organization as controlling Gaza. I'm not sure they would accept, any version of the current Palestinian Authority either, extending its authority over Gaza, although that was mooted at one point earlier in the war. And so it would have to be some kind of a caretaker regime, maybe with people from the Palestinian diaspora around the world returning there to help out. But that's what you're going to need. And so, that's a difficult ask, right? This could be a mission that would have to continue for 10, 15, or 20 years there. Could it then, its goal would be to transition to some form of Palestinian self-governance that Israel could accept and that the United States could accept. So there are a number of parameters laid out on the handout as to what I think this would require, and you could vary some of them, but for example, I think, Jewish settlements in Gaza, none of those. Some of the land swaps imagined in earlier peace proposals for the West Bank would also come back onto the table. But now with a new kind of urgency, maybe, some new lands southeast of Gaza, who knows, to reward a new Palestinian state with some recouped territory as well. Not listed here on these parameters is two enormous things, right? The right of return for Palestinians to different parts of Israeli territory. I'm not quite sure how that would be handled in a two-state solution now. It would have probably been easier to negotiate some of that, say in the year 2000 or 2008, some of the earlier phases of peace proposals. Maybe there's a way, or maybe after some number of years of peace between the Palestinian territory and Israel. Of course, you'd be talking about grandchildren returning to territories at that point, or great-grandchildren, but maybe it's possible. And then there's East Jerusalem. So that's just to say I haven't included everything you might want to discuss here. What about this, a single state? So this is what I think I was somewhat surprised when I put in like an anonymous vote with my college students, and to a person, it was unanimous. They all supported this, a single state solution. I was surprised. Maybe I don't have that many Jewish students in the class where I did this. That could be part of the reason, maybe. But nevertheless, it's astonishing how many young people in their 20s, maybe early 30s, seem to favor this. So I've taken note of that. Sometimes us old people maybe need to rethink our views in light of what the young say, right? How could this work? Well, Israel would annex the West Bank and Gaza, or would we call it a new country? A comprehensive peace plan? How would we ensure that each part of this enlarged state felt confident enough? Here it gets harder, right? To see if you have this kind of coalition, forces coming from a collection of nations, would they operate as police within Israel? And now you're talking about a sovereign nation. with alien forces operating as police in their own territory. So that's hard for me to imagine how that could work. Maybe there could be some right of return accomplished through purchases, you know, with an internationally established fund for this purpose. So could enough Palestinians feel safe? I mean, that's the doubt. And on the Israeli side, now you would have more Palestinians dispersed through or moving freely through Israel. I mean, I think you would have not only the fears that result from previous rounds of wars and attacks and intifadas, but very likely fears of revenge because of what's happened in Gaza. I mean, who wouldn't? They might not say it openly, but people will be thinking that, right? I mean, look what we've done, and look what, you know, people might want to take a little revenge for that. So unfortunately, I feel that what's happened in Gaza has cast grave doubt over the viability of this scenario, at least in the near future, but I'm very happy to hear your arguments to the contrary. If you've got, maybe you could have creative proposals. This is an old proposal, number D. I don't like it. A single state with political apartheid. I mean, apartheid is listed as a crime against humanity in the Rome Statute of the ICC, right, the criminal court. But yet this was proposed, a Palestinian author, this is quite a while ago now, right, Sari Misabaya. I guess, I don't think it was just tongue-in-cheek. I mean, I think he was actually trying to make a serious proposal, the thought being that at the time that this might have been acceptable, you know, you're not going to have millions of Palestinian voters, but you could have civil rights, equal, you know, some maybe parity in education, and the thought being that over, you know, a couple decades of that peaceable relations, people grow to know and trust one another, right? As was the hope of so many radical reformers after the American Civil War, and of course that didn't work out so well, right? It took another 100 years, so hopefully that won't be the case with Israel and Palestinian areas. But that was a proposal. It's hard to see now, to me, how that would help, really, because I don't think the fear would be so much just about Palestinian votes. I mean, there would be concern about that for sure among many Israelis, but there would be other far larger concerns as well. And that, I guess, was what Ms. Abaya was trying most to address with this, despite its facially shocking nature as a proposal for literal apartheid. Here's one you might have seen in the news, and I'll wrap up here in the interest of time so we can have discussion. The single state plan with regional autonomy or federation, right? So Bosnia is like this now in the former Yugoslavia. Bosnia is really two countries in one, right? I don't think this is quite what was intended in the Dayton Peace Accords, but it's what's happened. And so technically, you know, Bosnia is not divided into two countries, but in fact, you have a more Muslim and a more Christian area, and so they've largely segregated. But maybe in another generation that will reverse, right? People will intermarry, and economic relations do exist between those two halves of Bosnia, and so, you know, that's a very loose federation, almost in name only there, but conceivably one could imagine that as, one would be able to say that on paper you haven't divided, you know, what once was Greater Palestine into two countries. You have effectively a one-state solution, but you have the benefits of a two-state reality within it. It's interesting. I mean, was this the Century Foundation? I think the analysts there did a good job in trying to map out how this would work. It was, you know, worth the attempt to think through. But it's difficult, right? I think, again, you would need the coalition of forces to help very clearly, but now, again, they'd be operating oddly within a sovereign nation. Right, you would have to partition, you know, the country in some way, so you would still be drawing a line. People would wonder, well, why not just have two states at that point? How many settlements would you have to remove in the West Bank? Obviously, those difficulties would still be there. But nevertheless, I mean, the defenders of this, I mean, they argue that
the error of the Oslo process was that it aimed for a hard physical separation with, I hate to put it this way, but a Jew-free Palestine, right? That's their language from the report. But yeah, that's a problem. I mean, and I think the reason that many young people in their 20s favor a single state, from what I can tell, is the sense that we don't want this kind of ethnic, I mean, the dangers of kind of an ethnically purified state are too well known in history, so why should we now do that here and try to solve this 80-year-old problem that's been so destructive for all of, not just in the region, but really all of humanity in a sense. So why should we repeat that here? So that's one of their best arguments, I think, for this. And maybe it would help with Jerusalem, right? Because you could have Jerusalem be in some way not really part of either of these sections, or a line through leaving parts of East Jerusalem to the more kind of Palestinian side wouldn't be a hard national border. So maybe it helps with that. So yeah, worth keeping in mind, given, my God, we've got to do something, right, other than the status quo. And lastly, well, this is from a book written by a Jewish author who I think, is a pretty strong defender of current policies against, so I wanted an example like that in the mix here. Retrocession. I thought this was crazy when I first read it. I'm not sure how old this proposal is, but in other words, Jordan takes back most of the West Bank, Egypt takes back Gaza. There's no Palestinian state, so that pleases many Israeli politicians and Israeli citizens. But yeah, the doubts about that are obvious and immediate, right? I mean, how happy would Palestinians be divided now between two countries? Would they trust the regimes in Cairo, right, or in Jordan to protect them adequately? I mean, there are historical issues with that, on which I'm no expert, but that I think would come immediately to the fore, right? And then, other people in those countries would say, well, there's some concern, some bigotries, I think, against Palestinians and some part of the Egyptian and Jordanian populations. Now, I hope I'm wrong on that. If you think I'm wrong, please correct me. But that's just my very kind of anecdotal impression. But I will say, I mean, here's a comparable case, and with this I'll conclude. We have a situation with Kurdish peoples, right, divided between really four countries, right? Northeast Syria, northern Iraq, northwest Iran, and southeast Turkey. That's great for them, right? They're stretched across four nations and crossing their borders, and so many problems have resulted for them from that. Will there ever be a Kurdistan? I doubt it in my lifetime, surely. Maybe, but it would be easier for each of those countries to create regional autonomy. Say just take Syria, right, with the new regime, has to negotiate a constitution, and I sure hope by some miracle they do a good job. Maybe you could have regional autonomy. This idea, the usefulness of regional autonomy as a tool is argued by Duke philosopher Alan Buchanan with a number of good examples. I think it's quite a powerful argument. Not a cure-all in every case, but for example, the southern island in the Philippines, right, majority Muslim. There was a revolutionary secession movement that took place there a few years ago. Problem was solved by giving them some level of regional autonomy. A little like Scotland within the United Kingdom, or Quebec over here, right, or Canada. So, yes, thank you, right. Actually, that's a perfect note on which to end. So maybe the Canadians have the solution for what needs to be done in Gaza. Thank you, I hope some of that's helpful. I'm happy to discuss. Sorry, you didn't see the